So we're going to be talking about some techniques to avoid swirl marks in both raw wood and between coats. Swirl marks are a big issue when screening, especially when staining, especially when dealing with difficult woods like maple. So we're going to be talking about a couple of our products, red heat screens and SandDollar, that can kind of help you eliminate some of those problems, but also talk about techniques with the buffer and some different combinations of backup pads that can help you avoid those problems. So this is the driver plate that came with the buffer, and if everyone can see, this has really long tines on it. As a preference, I kind of like the driver plates that have the real small hooks, very fine hooks. What I found is that I think these, when you have the driver pad on there, these long hooks tend to push through and almost put pressure points on the screen on the floor, which can leave marks. And also because of that, you wind up having to put either a thick white pad or really double up or triple up on the pads to kind of avoid that. Lots of people like to use the thick white. One thing I really don't like about it is because it's thicker, one thing it does, as you, the thicker you have, the softer you go on a pad, it softens the cut of the screen. So what you have to wind up doing is you have to wind up probably bearing down more in the buffer to kind of blend out edger marks, and that can cause dish out. But also as these wear, they can kind of get a wobble in them. So just like if you have a unevenness, vibration in your big machine, your edger, if you have any kind of wobble in your buffer, if it's not running smooth, that can translate to the floor and cause marks. So you want to have a pad on there so that buffer's running as smooth as possible. So the best kind of combination I found is running Maroon pad as your main driver, as your main backup pad on the driver plate, and then using a thin white screen driver pad. So I kind of found that that combination gives the kind of the best cushion to help cushion the screen enough to help minimize marks, but also it's stiff enough to kind of avoid dish out. Gives you enough aggressiveness to blend out swirl marks. So the product I'm going to be talking about here is first is red heat screens. This is a ceramic grain. It's the only ceramic grain screen on the market. Now the difference between a ceramic grain screen, this screen, and a traditional black screen has to do with the type of grain. Black screen uses silicon carbide grain. Now the main difference is silicon carbide is, we talk about grains fracturing. Grains fracture differently. So when we talk about silicon carbide, as you're sanding, silicon carbide grain breaks off in big chunks. So anyone who's used a screen, you throw a black screen on the floor, you've noticed that as soon as you put the green screen on the floor, it sheds. You get tons of grain on the floor right away. The other thing with silicon carbide grain is it can be long and spindly. So some of those long grains will dig into the floor or a finish, and that's what's leaving your swirl marks. The nice thing about a ceramic grain is all the grain is very uniform in shape and size. So if you looked at this under a microscope, it would look like small triangles, very uniform. So while it can be aggressive, it leaves a very shallow scratch and a very consistent scratch. Another product we're going to talk about is the SandDollar. So we have different color SandDollars, but these are mainly designed for between coats, but I'm still going to talk about bare wood for this second. One of these, our core SandDollar, can actually be used on bare wood to really help refine the scratch and pretty much eliminate any swirl mark. So in this section, where we just finished with a 120 grit screen, if you really wanted to make sure there were no marks at all, or if you were doing a maple job that you had to do a dark stain on, and you want to make sure there were no marks, eliminate any chance of a swirl mark, if after the screen you went back over the floor with the blue SandDollar, there would be virtually no marks. It would eliminate any marks from the screen. The reason it does that is we have a grain bonded to a foam backing, and what that does is it allows the pad to glide across the floor and conform to the floor, and what happens is the grain, as it goes over the floor, as it hits different spots, will actually push up into the foam instead of digging into the surface. And that's where your swirl marks will come from, whether on a screen or whether using a paper disc. The grain, as it goes across the floor and it hits uneven spots, grain, and you can have different size grain, longer grain, those grains will dig in, and that's where the swirl marks come from, those longer grains that are digging into the floor. So this really helps eliminate that. Now this side over here, I had pre-done, and I sanded this to 100 grit with the belt sander. I hit it with a 120 grit red heat screen, and then I hit it with a blue SandDollar, and then water popped it. And afterwards, if you want to look, there's really no marks in it. Now this isn't maple, it's oak, which you can get by a little easier with marks, but still, depending on what you're doing, it's going to leave a real fine finish. And it's not going to burnish off the wood that much. Typically, if you're going to do maple, you're going to sand it fine anyways. You're going to have to water pop to get the color. But with using this and water popping, you're still going to get that same depth that you normally would.
One of the cool things about the SandDollar is you don't have to be as aware of the orientation of the buffer, because it's much more forgiving than a screen or a hard plate would be.
So now we're going to talk about between coats. So this side we had stained. Nowadays, with the popularity of darker stains, a lot of people are into ebony stains, and you have a lot of homes now with lots of lighting, big windows, can lights everywhere. It really highlights any imperfections, whether it's sanding imperfections, whether it's marks in the finish. They really show up. So where the SandDollar really shines is, again, that same technology that I talked about, the grain on the foam backing that kind of glides over the floor, helps eliminate marks in that. It does the same for the finish. It glides over the finish. Any piece of grain that might stick into the floor, it pushes back up into the foam pad. So it doesn't allow the grain, doesn't allow some of those swirl marks. Because of the foam, if something gets stuck on this, again, just like the grain, it will push up into the foam and not into the floor. So it's pretty much impossible to get a swirl mark using the pads. Like Bob said, they're foolproof and color coded. So there's four different ones. Blue is for originally designed for between coats of finish, but the blue is good for doing a recoat, old finish, taking out lots of wear marks. The next one up is medium one, which is the red one, which is really good for between coats of oil-based polyurethane. The yellow is the fine, which is really good for between coats of water-based finish. There's a green, which is a very fine, which is good for if you just want to put if you just want to do very light sanding before a final coat of whether oil-based poly or water-based, where you don't really have to do too much to take out any roughness. So on this side, we have a couple coats of water-based sealer, our VNC sealer. We're going to hit that with the yellow SandDollar. Oh, let me get the blue one off. Now the nice thing about this too is because it conforms to the floor and it's not very aggressive, you don't have to worry about any chance of the pad cutting through stain. So even if there was only one coat of sealer on this, you could run that pad and you wouldn't have to worry about it cutting through the stain in any spot. Because while it's soft enough and cushioned enough to not cut through the stain, it's also aggressive enough and to smooth out the finish and give a good enough scratch to get a good mechanical bond with the next coat of finish.
Ta-da! You don't want to, obviously this is a stained floor and it's got a coat of sealer on it. You don't want to overwork it and cut through the color. If you're doing a dark stained floor, one of the easiest techniques I've found is you stain your floor, wait for that stain manufacturer's recommended dry time, seal it, put a coat of finish on it, and then buff it.
So a couple other techniques to talk about, say on bare wood. What you can do is, another thing to kind of help avoid marks is, say you want is almost to do two screenings. You could do a more aggressive screening, say with your 100 grit, 120 grit, with a kind of a driver pad system like I mentioned, and then come back with, say, a thick white pad with a finer grit. Say you wanted to try and blend out edges in the field with a 100 grit screen. You could always come back with a more cushioned backup system with either a couple of extra maroon pads or a thick white pad with the finer grit screen, 120 grit screen. You've already done most of your heavy screening to flatten everything out, blend those edges in the field. But if you cushion the finer grit screen, it'll blend out those marks because really all you're doing is refining the scratch at that point. So with the more cushioned backup pad, you don't have to worry about dishing out the floor. So that's another technique you can use, aside from the SandDollar. You can try and vary up the backup pads, and also kind of what you're doing. Again, you can do a couple different screenings to really refine the scratch.
Another point is you get some powder buildup on these SandDollars. Just hose them off, vacuum them, beat them out, put them back in your truck, let them dry, and use them again. Don't think that they're done. If you vacuum them real well, pound the dust off of them and hose them off, you're going to save yourself a bunch of money. And we like to sell a lot of SandDollars, but I know y'all like to save a few bucks here and there. The same thing holds true with your screens, especially the red heat screens. They really last. Don't be afraid to wash them out and use them again. You can wet screen with these. These are basically the same techniques that the guys in the marble industry use to polish marble, so they can be used wet or dry. You can clean them out. Don't be penny wise and pound foolish. Keep them clean, keep your equipment clean. Try to use a vacuum cleaner. Makes your life a lot easier.
We're going to talk about some buffing techniques. Because you can have the proper products, but it's important to know how to run the buffer. When we talk about running the buffer, we're going to talk about clocking the buffer, similar to how you clock an edger, angling it to get the best cut. So we're not going to just take the buffer and run it across the floor, just straight like this or up and down. We're actually going to kind of angle it on the floor.
All right, when we do these, when we teach this at the different NWFA schools, we refer to this machine as a motor on a stick. And when you're standing behind this machine, you consider the very front of the machine being 12 o'clock. The right part of the machine, you want to realize that it's actually cutting between 3 and 3:30. So if I orient this machine the way I'm holding it now, I'm literally cutting across the grain, and I'm going to leave more intense swirl marks and scratch marks. That's fine if you want to get a floor flat, if you're using it as a hard plate with sandpaper on there and you want to be more aggressive. But when you want to pull the scratches out and blend in the work from the big machine to your edger work, you want to orient that part of the buffer to where the scratch pattern is going with the grain of the wood, not across the grain of the wood. The most work that you need to do is to blend in the edger to the big machine work. And that's where you want your screens to be the most aggressive. So when you start, do the perimeter first and then work your way into the field. Don't start in the field or one side of the room and work your way all the way over the other side, because where you start it's more aggressive, where you finish is going to be the least aggressive.
I talked to a lot of people, they wind up with halos a lot. Pretty much any of those issues can be fixed with proper screening. A lot of people may spend a lot of time using sometimes hand sanding, orbital sanders on the edges to get out edger marks, but pretty much any proper screening should eliminate any type of halo. This is the side that's cutting, so this is the aggressive side doing the cutting. So as you move up and down the floor, so you're going to do a row and it's going to be cutting here. As you do your next row, you're going to be rotating the buffer, and now this side over here is your feathering side. That side is going to be going over the section that you just buffed. So it's going to kind of feather out those scratches. So as if you think about it, as you're moving across the floor, you have an aggressive side of the buffer that's doing the buffing, blending out the marks from the big machine. And then as you come back the opposite way, you rotate the buffer. The opposite side is kind of feathering out. It has a much lighter cut.
My friend would say, thank you very much.